Hello again, first grade friends. It's Mario and Mrs. Rice here. I hope that you're having a wonderful day of e-learning. I've got my St. Patrick's Day gear on here that I was planning to wear to school, so I'm going to wear it for our read aloud today. We have been reading the book 3 Adventures on Deckawoo Drive, and we just finished a really good story about Leroy. And that story had a really happy ending. I was so glad that Leroy and Maybelline were reunited, weren't you? We're now getting ready to start another story in this text. And this one is called Francine Poulet Meets the Ghost Raccoon. Now, you may remember that Francine is the animal control officer that's been in some of the Mercy Watson books that we've been reading throughout the year. So I'm kind of excited about this story where she gets to take center stage as the main character. Let's read and see what happens. Are you excited too, Mario? This is actually Mario's nap time, so he might get a little sleepy during our story, but maybe he'll be able to stay awake. Okay, Francine Poulet Meets the Ghost Raccoon. Chapter 1. Francine Poulet was an animal control officer. She hailed from a long line of animal control officers. Francine's father, Clement Poulet, had been an animal control officer, and Francine's grandmother, Nanette Poulet, had been an animal control officer too. Francine had won many animal control trophies, 47 of them to be exact. In addition, Francine was the Gisford County record holder for most animals controlled. She had successfully and officially and expeditiously, for the most part, captured dogs, cats, rats, pigs, snakes, squirrels, chipmunks, bats, raccoons, and also fish. One time, Francine had faced down a bear. The bear and Francine had stared at each other for a long time. I'm going to show you the picture here that they included. Francine and the bear staring each other down. The bear blinked first. Francine Poulet was an excellent animal control officer. She was never, ever afraid. Late one afternoon in May, the phone at the Animal Control Center rang. Francine Poulet was sitting at her desk. She answered the phone. She said, "Animal Control Officer Francine Poulet here. How may I help you?" "Yes, hello," said the voice at the other end. "Miss Bissinger speaking." "Uh-huh," said Francine. "I am being tormented," said Mrs. Bissinger. "Yep," said Francine. Everyone who called the Animal Control Center was being tormented in one way or the other. Francine was never surprised to hear about it. Nothing frightened Francine Poulet, and nothing surprised her either. "A most unusual raccoon has come to reside on my roof," said Mrs. Bissinger. "Right," said Francine. "Raccoon on the roof. What's your address?" "Perhaps you were not listening," said Mrs. Bissinger. "This is not your average raccoon." "Right," said Francine. "Not your average raccoon." She leaned back in her chair, and then she leaned back a bit further. Francine leaned back so far that the front legs of the chair lifted off the ground. This was a bad habit of Francine's. Her father, Clement Poulet, had tried to break her of it, but he had never succeeded. "One of these days, Franny," her father used to say, "you're going to tip all the way backwards in that chair and whack your head, and then you'll be sorry." Clement Poulet was dead, and it had been many years since he had warned his daughter about chair tipping. Francine missed Clement. She even missed his dire predictions. However, she had yet to tip all the way backward and whack her head. Francine had been gifted with an extraordinary sense of balance. "This raccoon," said Mrs. Bissinger, "shimmers." "He what?" said Francine. "Shimmers," said Mrs. Bissinger. "He seems to glow. In addition, and more disturbingly, this raccoon calls my name." Oh my goodness, a shimmering raccoon that calls her name? I want to read and find out more. Francine slowly lowered the chair's legs to the floor. "Interesting," said Francine. "The raccoon says Mrs. Bissinger?" "No," said Mrs. Bissinger. "He says Tammy. He screams my first name. He screams it like a banshee. Perhaps this raccoon is a ghost raccoon. There are no ghosts, said Francine Poulet, and there are no ghosts of raccoons. Be that as it may, said Mrs. Bissinger, there is a shimmery raccoon on my roof who calls my name, and so on. Right, said Francine. The address? 4214 Flicker Street, said Mrs. Bissinger. I'll see you tonight, said Francine. Bring a ladder, said Mrs. Bissinger. The roof is very steep and very high. You are not afraid of heights, are you? I'm not afraid of anything, said Francine. How inspiring, said Mrs. Bissinger. I look forward to making your acquaintance. And I look forward to catching your raccoon, said Francine. She hung up the phone. She leaned back in her chair and studied her trophies. All 47 of them. She started to hum. Francine's father had always told her that she was like a refrigerator. What he said exactly was, Franny, you are the genuine article. You are solid. You are certain. You are like a refrigerator. You hum. Francine leaned back in her chair. She balanced the chair on her two legs. A talking ghost raccoon, she said. I don't think so. She hummed louder. She leaned back farther. Watch out, Mr. Raccoon, said Francine Poulet. I'm going to get you. What do you think, Mario? Do you think we should keep reading to find out a little bit more about this ghost raccoon? All right, Mario's hooked, and hope you are too. We're going to head right on into Chapter 2. If you've got a copy of this book, you can follow along with us too. Chapter 2. That night, Francine Poulet drove her animal control truck to 4214 Fleecker Street. She rang the doorbell. A woman wearing a large diamond necklace, dangling ruby earrings, several flashy rings, and a multi-stone brooch answered the door. Francine squinted. Mrs. Bissinger? She said. Exactly, said Mrs. Bissinger. Tammy Bissinger. How do you do? I do just fine, said Francine. I'm here about your raccoon. I assumed, said Mrs. Bissinger. She stood there glittering. And so on, she said. Well, said Francine. Okay then, I think I will just head up on the roof and catch this raccoon. You will find him to be a very wily adversary, almost supernatural in his abilities, said Mrs. Bissinger. Uh-huh, said Francine. He insists on saying my name, said Mrs. Bissinger. Yep, said Francine, you told me that. Has a raccoon ever said your name? Nope, said Francine. She turned her back on Mrs. Bissinger and headed to the truck. She unloaded her ladder. She retrieved her net. She checked her flashlight for batteries, and then Francine put the ladder against the side of the house. She turned the flashlight on and put it between her teeth. She grasped the net firmly in one hand and a rung of the ladder firmly in the other. Francine started to climb. As she climbed, she hummed. She was solid. She was certain. She was an animal control officer, Francine Poulet. At the top of the ladder, Francine stepped out onto the roof, shook the flashlight out of her mouth. She turned and shone it back at the ground, and there was Mrs. Bissinger standing and looking up at her, all her jewelry twinkling and glowing. Be careful, shouted Mrs. Bissinger. He is an extraordinary raccoon. He shimmers. He screams like a banshee, and so on. Right, said Francine. Yep, you told me. He shimmers. He screams like a banshee. Got it. Francine turned off the flashlight. The thing about catching wild animals is to not let them smell your fear. Since Francine Poulet was never, ever afraid, this was not a problem for her. The other thing about catching wild animals is that the more you chase them, the faster they run. It is best to let the wild ones come to you. Francine sat down on the roof. She stretched her arms and legs. She cracked her knuckles, and she hummed. What are you doing? Shouted Mrs. Bissinger from down below. Francine ignored her. It was pleasant sitting on the roof in the dark, ignoring Mrs. Bissinger. Francine hummed louder. Oh, Mr. Raccoon, whispered Francine. Everything is perfectly fine. There was no one here except for you and me. And we are friendly friends, you and me. Francine closed her eyes, and she hummed some more. She heard a footfall, and then another footfall. Francine smiled, a very big smile, without opening her eyes. She kept humming. Slowly, slowly, she reached out and put her hand on the animal control net. And then there came a high-pitched scream. Oh my goodness. Who or what is making that sound? I love the illustration here. I'm going to turn it around and show it to you. So there's Francine, poised to catch whatever is on that roof. And here's the raccoon. And he looks really fierce. I was Francine, I would be afraid, but she seems to have no fear. Let's keep reading. We're almost to the end of this chapter. It did not sound like the raccoon was saying Tammy. Instead, it sounded like this. Franny! Francine couldn't believe it. The raccoon was saying her name. She opened her eyes just in time to see a shimmery, raccoon-shaped object flying through the air. It was headed directly for her. Franny! Screamed the ghost raccoon. I love how the author here showed us how we should be saying this part. They've got it all stretched out and really exaggerated. So when I'm reading with the expression, I can read it like that too, and you can read it like that too when you see authors do that. Animal Control Officer Francine Poulet, daughter of Animal Control Officer Clement Poulet, granddaughter of Animal Control Officer Nanette Poulet, was, for the first time in her life, afraid. In fact, she was terrified. As you can see from the illustration, she really is. Her hair is standing up on end. And we're going to stop here today in this adventure about Francine Poulet. And we will pick up tomorrow with chapter 3. I hope you have been enjoying that story. My goodness, Mario enjoyed it. And I think it's time for him to take a little nap now. All right, Mario, say goodbye to all my first grade friends. And we'll see you later. Bye.